We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
In the wake of the landmark Supreme Court ruling on American gun rights, most firearm cases have followed the ruling in expanding rather than contracting the right to keep and bear arms, but not in all cases. And we're joined by Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, constitutional attorney, and host of the excellent Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott DeCosenza, Esquire, to figure out if the spirit of the law is facing a legal exorcism. Welcome back, Scott.
If you haven't written me a check, I'm not your lawyer. Let's get that out.
I'll send you $1 via Venmo. That's still a thing, right? Venmo.
The kids today, who knows what they're
kids today, right? Yeah. So carrier pigeons. It's the new cool way. So Scott, there's a case out of Washington State that appears to be going. Let's say it's going somewhat against the grain in terms of granting more leeway with Second Amendment rights. Can you give us the details, please?
Well, broadly speaking, we've seen a sea change in how these things all work since the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruen case. That case requires, it's the current landmark decision in our Second Amendment jurisprudence, and it requires basically that there's some sort of like historical tie-in to gun rights restrictions on the legislative side. This is a little bit different. This is on the punitive justice side. This is about a January 6th defendant who, as part of his sentencing of probation, had his Second Amendment rights stripped, at least for that time. He challenged the ruling and said that basically it was a violation of his Second Amendment rights in the wake of the Bruen case. And the courts so far have said, no, that's not accurate. You're allowed to have your rights stripped away in this instance. But the trend, Mark, go ahead.
I think the bone of contention here is that the gentleman in question, he was charged with and pled guilty, I believe, to, it was either a picketing, a demonstrating, or a protesting charge, which is a misdemeanor. And so while he's on probation, they're now, well, this particular judge has, and the prosecutors in the case, have looked to strip him of his Second Amendment rights for what is probation of a misdemeanor. And I think many people worry if that could create a very dangerous precedent, couldn't it?
Well, what the judge wrote was that the person's role in the mob was minor, but the fact of his participation in an insurrection whose aim was to impair the peaceful transfer of power suggests that a firearms restriction during his probationary period is appropriate. So
let me stop you there, Scott. Was he charged with insurrection?
Well, no, Mark. It has to. We have to lay it out. It's not just any misdemeanor that the person was involved in, and it is this specific misdemeanor. And so it is appropriate. I think that we would hope that all sentencing judges would take the totality of the circumstances into consideration when they're issuing their judgments.
So would not other cases now, or other judges and prosecutors, use this as a precedent to limit further future defendants' right to keep and bear arms if they are also prosecuted under a misdemeanor?
Well, they may. I would say that...
Isn't that a thin end of the wedge kind of deal, Scott?
I want to say, though, just to be clear, you use the word precedent, and this decision does not have precedential value as of yet. If it goes up and is further challenged and upheld, then it may have precedential value. But yes, and prosecutors throwing the phone book at a defendant, as we can see with the January 6th and many other prosecutions, is not something that's new. So yes, the answer to your question is yes, we can expect to see this in the future by prosecutors.
And we can expect to see this challenged, I would presume.
Yes, I would expect that many of the pro-gun organizations, some of which I give money to support, as do all these pro-gun nuts in America here, to try to fight these impositions on our Second Amendment rights. I would expect that there will be an appeal filed.
Well, let's visit another potential infringement on Second Amendment rights with the Joe Biden administration. Now, I believe that the president is attempting to strip Second Amendment rights from marijuana users in states where marijuana use is legal. Now, I may not have this completely accurate, Scott, but it seems to me that this is a constitutional bucket list of weird things to worry about, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that the way that to think about it in the broad strokes is that Joe Biden is now and always has been very hostile to any kind of letting up on the drug war. We know about the crime bill, of course, which sent so many Americans to prison that Joe Biden drafted when he was a senator. And even as president, he hasn't released the kind of the reins on our regulatory structure with respect to marijuana. And in fact, the exact opposite is true, Mark. He has tightened it down really the most of any president. Now, there only have been a few presidents since marijuana has sort of been a relaxed regulatory posture in America. So maybe that's not saying too much, but at least since Obama, we've had this sort of compromise where marijuana is illegal federally, but legal in many states, depending on the state and the usage type and so on and so forth. But the feds have basically had a hands-off posture to Americans who were obeying state law and didn't sort of interfere with their other rights. But that's now changing, and massively so. The Biden administration is coming after Americans who use marijuana to strip them of their gun rights. It seems like they're using simply everything they can to try to strip gun rights from Americans wherever they can, whether that's at, trying to pass new laws that strip their rights, working through the courts, and in this way through the executive agencies.
But surely there's a separation issue here, isn't there?
Well, it's not so much, I think, it's a separation issue as them overstepping their bounds. That people who haven't been necessarily convicted of anything, may suffer the loss of their rights. This is a cautionary tale, Mark, for all Americans who live in states where, in order to procure marijuana legally under state law, they have to sign up or be put on some registry or get a prescription that's then entered into a central database, because those databases and those that information is now being used against them. And we can only expect, the smart money bet is that it's not going to be used less in the future, but there'll be more avenues of stripping Americans' rights in the future.
So let's call back to the Bruen decision for a second that we started this Talking Liberty segment on, Scott. With both the Washington State case and to a greater extent, what the Joe Biden administration is attempting now with marijuana users, do you see this as a full court press back against the landmark Supreme Court ruling? And is there any way for the Supreme Court to restate and restate again what they've already stated?
Right. Well, that is the bane of a Supreme Court justice's existence, I imagine, when they've clearly articulated the law and they get back something else from the lower courts. I do see this as a doubling and tripling down on a push for any possible way for them to restrict Americans' gun rights. That's sort of how I process it all. And for the courts, Bruen was only a 2022 case. So in the now 24-hour news cycle, we are, I think, accustomed to seeing things happen very quickly, but that's generally not the way courts work. And on major issues like this, I would expect to see a slower pace getting to the result, hopefully, which is the full expression of the implementation of the Bruen decision and more rights respected by the feds on gun rights.
And Scott D. Cosenza will be covering all the gun news on the pages of libertynation.com. Scott, thanks ever so much for being here.
Thank you, Mark.
And that just about wraps us up for this week on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides, and I'd like to thank today's guests, Andrew Moran, Dave Patterson, Joe Schaefer, and Scott D. Cosenza, and of course you, the listeners, for joining us. To leave you with a smile for this week, I'd just like to share one of my favorite ancient Chinese proverbs. It goes, unless we change direction, we're likely to end up where we were headed. Now, there's something to think about there when we consider the particular direction that the US is heading in, one in which inflation robs people of their savings and their futures, where the price of essential goods, oil, and even food are both unstable and increasing. We have to realize that this is likely what's behind the anti-establishment sentiment so much of the country is feeling. Now, polling tells that just 33% of likely US voters think the country is headed in the right direction. And that's not a good number for people, and certainly not a good number for politicians. Sometimes it feels as though the world is reaching a grand crescendo, and no election, regardless of the result, is going to fix the deafening cacophony that follows behind that. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner. Joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors. Deconstructing leftist narratives. Debating the hot topics. And remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe
You only
space.
did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5.